Hello. I used to be a strong anti-Zionist. As a firm leftist, it was only logical to me to be one, and I used to be certain that I know a lot about the Israeli apartheid regime and its brutal oppression of the Palestinians, and I had many people around me who shared that supposed knowledge. Then I started spending quite a lot of time with someone who didn't, but what struck me was that he was the most consequent leftist that I had known at the time, of whom I had heard that he used to donate his newspaper delivery money to NGOs, and that he had read many of Marx's works, and so on, and yet he kept coming up with counter-arguments when I criticized Israel's wrongdoings. Originally, I started reading more and more in order to be able to counter his arguments. However, that process eventually led to me seeing things differently. And I owe my friend Dimitri a lot of gratitude for his perseverance. In the end, his stamina and the consistency of his argumentation has incited me to dive deeper into the topic. I know that not everybody has the privilege of finding such a counterpart, and that is why, amidst the ongoing war between Israel and Iran and its proxies, I have decided to publish this presentation in which I am trying to dismantle common myths about Israel. A presentation originally designed for a dear friend of mine who I'm also having a deep conflict with regarding this topic. And this presentation can only be seen as a door opener. Much more reading, much more research must be done, must follow this presentation, as the topics that I'm talking about can only be touched superficially, and many other important topics remain unmentioned. The presentation is directed at all those that find it hard to fathom how people that care about human rights and have an interest in the association of free individuals, as Marx calls his vision of a more human society, how such people can support the military actions of the Israeli state. I've put a lot of effort into providing accessible and diverse sources for everything that I'm claiming in the presentation, which can be accessed from the PDF document, which I'm attaching below. Furthermore, I have included many articles, lectures, and documentaries, etc. for further reading, further information. And I suggest that while listening to the presentation, you try to imagine that everything I said were true. Then afterwards, ask yourself the question, if everything I just heard were true, would I consider it necessary to stand with Israel? If yes, you can then dive deeper into the sources and look for others and find out for yourself whether it is true. If not, then please bring forth your argument. I am open to discuss anything that I'm talking about on the basis of reason, and I am consciously inviting many people that will not be convinced by the input I'm giving to contact me and discuss the topic, as long as it happens in a humane manner. This shall be it. Proceeding to the presentation now. I've named the presentation Israel, Gaza, Human Rights. Later on, you will find out why I picked this picture for the opening slide. Who are we seeing here, and why is it relevant in the context of the presentation? I will first talk about anti-Semitism in general, theories of anti-Semitism, differences between anti-Semitism and racism, then try to historically approach Israel, the modern state of Israel and its predecessors and whatever happened in the centuries before the foundation of the state of Israel, to then take a closer look at the wars against Israel. The first part is rather theoretical. It includes sociological, psychological attempts to explain anti-Semitism, and I think it is crucial in order to understand the necessity of a state of Israel and what is going on in this conflict. Hard to understand that, or impossible to understand that, without a basis in anti-Semitism theory. Like I said, there are many topics that I'm only superficially touching in the presentation, or not even touching at all. Topics like the supposedly moderate PLO, the settlements, the history of the Palestinian resistance movement, the anti-Semitism of the UN, and many more. Again, I'm only trying to open a door here. A lot more reading must follow this presentation. If you encounter things that I'm saying that are definitely not true, or that can be expanded, or that should be put in a different way, please just hit me up and let me know what it is. Let's get to the first part then.
So I am now going to begin with definitions of anti-Semitism, or at least with an approach towards definitions of anti-Semitism.
Before we dive in, one thing is essential. The anti-Semite does not care about the religiosity of the Jews. Whether they believe or whether they do not believe, them being a Jew is an ethnic question in anti-Semitism, just as it was in the Nazi regime.
Let's begin with differentiating anti-Semitism from racism, because the two are, in today's discussion, they are often melted together, and it is often pretended that anti-Semitism is just a form of racism, whereas there is a racist form of anti-Semitism. The most relevant form of anti-Semitism that we encounter today is very distinct from racism, and that is why I'm going to distinguish the two. When racism tends to devaluate the groups of people that it has as its subject, anti-Semitism devaluates them, but especially also goes along with a negative valorization. Jews are imagined to be agents of power, rulers of the world, this image of the Jews as the puppet masters. Whereas black people, for example, in racism are seen as regressive and inferior. They are looked at as a biological subhuman inferior group, whereas Jews are assigned a superhuman cunning, and in that way they are demonized. The economic consequence of these differences is that Jews tend to be linked to the exchange value of the market, the capitalist market, whereas the subjects of racism tend to be linked to the utility value, which you can see, for example, in their colonial subjugation. Anti-Semitism is an ideology that wants to explain the world, or that comes with explanations for the world. And on the other hand, racism is a form of rule to legitimize social inequality. Racism has an identity function, a differentiation between, different supposed races, and therefore goes along with a self-formation. And anti-Semitism has a conscious function. I will also go into that a little deeper later on, but it has to do with splitting off parts of the self and projecting them on the Jews. It's essentially a mismanagement of the superego, which is an alternative to sublimation. Jews represent the near uncanny other, whereas the subjects of racism represent the other that is made foreign. I will now read from the definition of anti-Semitism of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, the media, schools, the workplace, and the religious sphere could, taking into account the overall context, include but are not limited to calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion, making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews as such or the power of Jews as collective, such as, especially but not exclusively, the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. Accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, or even for facts committed by non-Jews. Denying the fact, scope, mechanisms, for example gas chambers, or intentionality of the genocide of the Jewish people at the hands of National Socialist Germany and its supporters and accomplices during World War II, the Holocaust. Accusing the Jews as a people, or Israel as a state, of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Using the symbols or images associated with classic anti-Semitism, for example the claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis. Drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the State of Israel. Often you will hear on the media that there is a discussion whether the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which I just read of, is the appropriate anti-Semitism definition to work with, or whether the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which is then often brought up, is a more adequate version to work with. I will not go into that discussion here because once you've gone through this presentation, it hopefully becomes obvious. For now, let me just state that just because people claim to be aware of anti-Semitism and, hold on to this, for example, Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, it does not necessarily have to mean that they take it seriously. An important addition to understandings of anti-Semitism can be found in reading critical theory. For example, the elements of anti-Semitism in the Dialectics of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer. And in Adorno's analysis, he points out that essentially anti-Semitism is the rumor about the Jew. It's closely linked to so many conspiracy theories being founded in anti-Semitism. And Adorno analyzes that the unreflected projection of capitalist social formation often leads to anti-Semitic ideologies and worldviews. The Jew becomes the scapegoat of the inability to understand a more and more complex modern world. And in that scapegoat function is associated with the means of power. To dive deeper into the history of anti-Semitism, into definitions of anti-Semitism, I have attached a lecture on the history of anti-Semitism. You can copy the link from the PDF that you can find in the video information below. I will try to give an overview of the history of anti-Semitism, even though, again, I must say that this is only bits and parts of a topic that essentially is way too large to put it into a presentation that's a little bit more than an hour long. Jewish and Israelite culture is approximately 3,200 years old. An early form of anti-Judaism was driven by Christian substitution theology. Subsequently, in Europe and the Mediterranean, Jews were not given full civil rights despite political protection in some cases, and pogroms and massacres were often the consequences of crises that the different societies found themselves in. Again, Jews were made the scapegoats. In the 11th century, the Crusades, for example, led to rumors and anti-Jewish sentiments in Europe. In the 12th century, they suffered from systematic oppression. Jews were labeled as evil and as followers of a false faith. The yellow badge was introduced, the Jewish hat, and professional restrictions, except a restriction for money lending. Although the origins of the association of Jews with the sphere of money lie in ancient Roman times, in the medieval it has been strengthened. In the 14th century, laws of blood impurity were introduced by the Inquisition. In the 19th century, Jews were granted equal rights for the first time in some societies, beginning with the French Revolution. Simultaneously, new forms of anti-Jewish hatred emerged, connected with simplistic criticism of capitalism in many cases, or biological anti-Semitism. In the 20th century, Bolshevism was often labeled as Jewish, and Nazi ideology led to the murder of 6 million Jews. After 1945, so after the defeat of Nazi Germany, and from 1947 onwards, after the founding of the State of Israel, waves of anti-Semitic attacks, now labeled as anti-Zionist attacks, and pogroms, such as on October 7th, 2023, have been continuing to this very day. I will conclude this chapter about anti-Semitism with a take on anti-Semitism as a negative guiding idea of modernity. And I am quoting Samuel Salzborn here. The ideological connection between right-wing, left-wing, and Islamic anti-Semitism is characterized by a worldview that sees a Jewish world conspiracy behind everything and everyone. In practice, the hostility is directed not only against Israel and Jews worldwide, but also against everything associated by the anti-Semites with them. It's against the Enlightenment and liberalism, against modernity and individuality, against freedom and democracy. In other words, against every promise of individual freedom and happiness. Right-wing anti-Semitism is often strongly based in biologistic and racist ideas, and that's what I was referring to earlier. There is a more racist form of anti-Semitism, which we find in right-wing anti-Semitism, but it's something that we encounter more seldomly. And also the anti-Semitism of the right wing, of neo-Nazis and so on, is strongly consistent of the other forms of anti-Semitism as well. Then in left-wing anti-Semitism, we find the anti-Semitic criticism of capitalism and certain anti-imperialist ideas. That, of course, does not mean that any criticism of capitalism is anti-Semitic. There is just a superficial and regressive form of critique that associates the capitalists and the individuals in power with the Jews, and that believes that once these individuals, whether they're called Jews or not, are eliminated, the world would be a better place. And then we have Islamic anti-Semitism, which consists of anti-Semitic propaganda, for example, in connection with the Middle East conflict, but that dates back to the Quran, and I will later on quote from the Quran and from strongly anti-Semitic passages in it. So you can see that these distinct forms of anti-Semitism are also merged in the way that they're an ideology of integration. All of them are. I will pause or end the chapter on anti-Semitism in general here and proceed with anti-Semitism and Israel. Let us first look at Israel on a map. Here you can see a map of at least parts of the world, and then you can see a tiny, tiny, tiny little red spot, not exactly in the center, and that's Israel. So if you're a little bit educated in geography, you can see the large Arab world around it, and tiny, tiny Israel. Israel with an area of 22,380 square kilometers compared to 13.15 million square kilometers of the other Arab nations that surround it. About the ancient Jewish history of Israel. Early Judaism and the foundation of the Jewish kingdom in the region of modern-day Israel date back to the 13th century BCE. The ancient Jewish kingdom in Israel has been conquered by Romans, by Greeks, by Babylonians, and as a consequence, expulsions happened. In 70 CE, the Jewish temple was destructed by the Romans. In 637, the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem happened. In the 11th century, Jerusalem was conquered by the Crusaders. In 1291, it was conquered by the Mamluk Empire. In 1516, it was incorporated into the Ottoman Empire. Now, the first Zionist World Congress happened in 1897. That was before the modern state of Israel was founded, but it's closely linked to that. And why there is that link between the Zionist World Congress and the foundation of Israel has to do with what Zionism is. And that I'll try to explain next. In this picture, you see Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl is the originator of political Zionism, and I will only talk about political Zionism here. There is also religious Zionism, but it plays less of a role in my argumentation. What is Zionism? Zionism is a movement with the goal to establish, in this case, a secular Jewish nation. Herzl's Zionism, the Zionism of the 19th century, late 19th century, is a direct consequence of the anti-Semitism within strengthening European nations. So, in the 19th century, we see many nationalist movements within Europe. The people of a certain nationality united and try to establish nations. However, Jews were expelled from those national movements because it was said that Jews could not be parts of a German nation, for example, because they were said to be foreign to the body of the German nation, the German people. So it is said to be a negative nationalism. So a nationalism that only derives from not being able to assimilate in the other nationalisms. An event that symbolizes that and that had a strong influence on Herzl was the Dreyfus affair in France, in the supposedly enlightened French Republic, where a Jewish army general was wrongfully sued and imprisoned. The central idea of Zionism is that for thousands of years, Jews have been dependent from the goodwill of the respective rulers. It became apparent throughout history that this goodwill can shift at any given moment, even in seemingly enlightened nations. In order to overcome this dependency, Jews from all over the world require the possibility of Jewish self-defense. So in more simple words, for thousands of years, Jews have made the experience that they cannot rely on the rulers of the countries that they're a part of, that those rulers will defend them, so they have to start being able to defend themselves within a sovereign state. Now back to the historic events. First Zionist World Congress was in 1897, and it was at a time where anti-Semitism was rising in Europe. More and more Jews migrated to the area of modern-day Israel. There, again, Arab pogroms against the Jewish population happened, for example, in 1921 and in 1929. At the time, after the First World War, what used to be part of the Ottoman Empire was now mandatory Palestine from 1920 to 1948. So it was a British mandatory, and the Brits promised both the Jewish population of the area and the Arab, in that case the Egyptian side, a sovereign state. Here you can see the flag of mandatory Palestine from 1924, and you can see that in the center of the flag there is a Star of David. So be not misleaded by the word Palestine in mandatory Palestine. An Arab state called Palestine has never existed. The Palestinian national movement first came into existence in the 1960s, so more than a decade after the founding of the State of Israel. In 1947, the UN worked out a concept for the division of the area of modern-day Israel into an Arab state, a Jewish state, and an extraterritorial special international regime in Jerusalem. So 1947 were 2 years after the defeat of Nazi Germany, and the UN offered Jews and Arabs a sovereign state. Despite concerns about various aspects, for example, the defendability of the area that they were assigned due to the borders drawn by the UN, the Jewish Agency accepted the plan that the UN offered. All Arab nations rejected the plan. This is 1947, There could have been a sovereign Arab Palestinian state, or whatever they would have called it. All Arab nations rejected the plan that the UN made. 20 years later, in 1967, this position towards a Jewish state on Arab-Muslim soil was consolidated officially in the Khartoum Resolution by the Arab nations. I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but in the Khartoum Resolution, all leaders of the Arab League that were present to the 4th summit of the Arab League committed to 3 no's towards Israel. No to peace with Israel, no to recognizing Israel, no to negotiations with Israel. We'll jump back now, back to 1948. 1948, the year of the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. I will read an extract from that Declaration of Independence. The State of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and the ingathering of the exiles. End quote. Let me remind you that the idea of Zionism is that Jews have a right to defend themselves in the sovereign state. So it is only consequent that this Declaration of Independence expresses the openness of that state to all Jews. I'm quoting again from the Declaration of Independence. It will devote itself to the development of the country for the benefit of all of its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or gender. End quote. I'll read that again. All its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or gender. Has that been established? Has that been made reality? We will get to that later. Yes, it has. Quote again. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, another very important point, and will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. End quote. So take a look at that in close detail, and you may take that and compare it to actual Israeli politics rule. You can look at the way that the holy sites have been treated after the 1967 Six Days War, and take a look at many other details that I'm not going to dive into in this presentation. Since Israeli independence, the Declaration of Independence that I just read from was declared on May 14th, 1948, and on the same night, the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria attacked the newly established state. In the course of this war of independence, approximately 700,000 Arabs left their homes or were expelled. Today, it is often talked about that there are 5.3 million Palestinian refugees. These supposed 5.3 million Palestinian refugees have their own UN agency. There is one UN agency for refugees of the entire world, and one UN agency only for Palestinian refugees. These supposedly 5.3 million Palestinian refugees are the only refugee group that inherits a refugee status. Again, if you look up the numbers, around 700,000 Arabs were expelled from their homes. And today, we're talking about a number of approximately 5.3 million. Now, this is a little bit outdated. The number might now be higher because of the current war, but still, we have these incredibly different numbers. In addition to that refugee problem, another topic that I'm only touching upon here, but that could be dived into a lot deeper. Another important aspect is that the Palestinian refugees in the neighboring Arab countries are constantly kept in camps. They are denied citizenship. as an argumentary weapon in the fight against the Jewish state. It is now often claimed that when the Palestinians are negotiating with the Israelis, a condition for a Palestinian state must be the right for return for all those 5.3 million refugees. However, if you look at the population of Israel, you will see that if these 5.3 million were allowed to return to what's now Israel, there would not be a Jewish majority in the population anymore, and Israel would not be a Jewish state anymore. Because as soon as democratic elections happened, there would not be a Jewish majority. Of course, the people that demand that know that. And they know that with that claim and with that condition, it means the end of the state of Israel. Now, these originally 700,000 Arabs that had to leave their homes can be contrasted to approximately 850,000 Jews that were expelled from Arab countries after the War of Israeli Independence or were forced to flee. These 850,000 Jews are very, very seldomly talked about. There is a movie that I can highly recommend called The Silent Exodus. I linked it in the PDF that you can find in the video notes below. And there's also a Wikipedia page that lists the number of Jews or the size of the Jewish populations of the Arab countries before the foundation of the State of Israel and after. And you can see that in the Middle East alone, before 1948, there was a Jewish population of about 300,000. Today, the Jewish population measures about 400. Now let's talk about the aftermath of the War of Independence. Despite its size and despite the fact that it's the armies of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 states that attacked Israel, it won the war. Ever since then, it was attacked over and over again by its Arab neighbors in the course of the next decades. In this next chart, you can see the conflicts that Israel's been involved in ever since its founding. You can see who attacked Israel, and you can see who was attacked, namely Israel. I will leave the slide on for a couple of moments, not say much more about it. You can dive deeper into it and do your own research. So over and over, Israel is attacked and Israel defends itself. And nevertheless, the world talks about Israel as if Israel is the biggest threat to world peace, and not the countries that attack it. There have, however, been a variety of instances that are proof that if a country wants peace with Israel, it can have peace with Israel. Egypt was the first Arab country to sign a peace treaty with Israel in 1979. Jordan followed in 1994, and then, which is remarkable, in the Abraham Accords, so far 4 Arab countries have signed peace treaties with Israel: Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and the United Arab Emirates. What's especially remarkable are treaties like that with the United Arab Emirates, because not only do they include promises of not attacking each other, but they also include trade aspects, they include tourism, and they include what can be the actual beginning of a developing friendship. Now, if we take a closer look at the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, you can see that first, in the 1947 UN Partition Plan, the Arab side, including the Palestinian representatives, rejected peace. They rejected their own sovereign state. That was consolidated in 1967, then very often talked about today as an incredible chance. We have the Camp David negotiations in 2000. They were essentially rejected by the Palestinian side. The Oslo Accords were not ratified by the Palestinian side. I strongly recommend the further reading in this point. It is something that is seldom talked about because Arafat is said to be that strong, charismatic, and moderate Palestinian leader that made the Oslo Accords possible. However, if you take a closer look at what happened and why they were not followed by positive developments, you can find out that the Palestinian Authority never ratified the Oslo Accords. I'm now jumping to October 7th, 2023. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas terrorists and Palestinian civilians attacked Israeli territory.
Over 1,100 people were murdered, often in a brutal manner, including cases of rape, abuse, burning, and other atrocities.
251 hostages were abducted to the Gaza Strip, and the day marks the largest massacre of Jews in a single day since the Shoah. Since then, and the numbers that I'm referring to here are from the beginning of 2025, so they're not accurate anymore. But at the beginning of 2025, over 26,000 rockets have been fired at the Israeli civilian population from Gaza, Lebanon, that's the Hezbollah, Yemen, the Houthi militia, and Iran. Israel's military operation specifically targets military infrastructure, command centers, tunnels, weapon depots, and the leadership of terrorist organizations. The Israeli army announces its attacks via radio, leaflets, and other means, and urges the population to leave the targeted areas. You can see it currently in the attacks on Iran, when it attacks weapon storages, for example. It calls for the people to evacuate so that civilians do not die from the attacks. At the same time, in Gaza, we can see it over and over again that civilians are sacrificed as human shields by Hamas and also in Lebanon by Hezbollah, and are encouraged to embrace martyrdom in the fight against the Jewish enemy. This is one of the reasons why you can see such high numbers of casualties on, say, the Palestinian side compared to the number of deaths on the Israeli side. There is a variety of reasons, though. You have the fact that civilians are sacrificed as human shields, and that Hamas not only calls for them to stay, but it threatens them that if they evacuate, they will be treated as negotiators and as compliance of the Jews, and are threatened with death, essentially. And then again, Hamas also operates from civilian areas, but we will get to that later. International media often rely on information from the Hamas Health Authority, which should be viewed with significant skepticism. Amongst the people that have been killed in the war that followed 10/7, the IDF says that 20,000 of the people were Hamas terrorists.
Now, when we take a look back at the Second World War and the bombardment of Dresden by the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces, we've had a very high number of casualties as well, and within 3 days, up to 25,000 people were killed. Nevertheless, we know that it was in the fight against the Nazi enemy. And in their eliminatory anti-Semitism, the Nazis and the current enemies of the Jewish state have a large number of similarities, and the fight against Hamas and its allies is actually very comparable to the fight against Nazi Germany. However, Israel is internationally treated in a way that it must constantly legitimize its action. And that is despite of the fact that the state of Israel, Jewish self-defense, is actually the manifestation of anti-fascism, and its current fight, as well as all of the fights in the past decades against its enemies, are manifestations of military anti-fascism. Now back to the current conflict as well as the conflicts of the past decades.
Hamas and Hezbollah deliberately operate from residential areas, which is also another reason why the casualties are so high. They deliberately operate from hospitals, from schools, and refugee camps, as a variety of instances have shown again in the past couple of months, to make targeted Israeli operations as difficult as possible. Another incredibly important aspect when taking a look at the current war is that all ceasefires since the beginning of the war have been violated by Hamas. Again, if you are skeptical about that information, take a look at the sources that I've given. You can find further sources as well. On top of all of these things, we may never forget that at any given moment the war could end. The Israeli bombardments and military action could end if Hamas released the remaining hostages, which they, to this very day, decline to do.
I am now going to proceed with talking about the enemies of Israel. And out of the three people that you can see in this slide, fortunately, only one is still alive. On the left, we can see Hassan Nasrallah, former leader of the Islamist terrorist organization, the Hezbollah. In the center, you can see Yahya Sinwar, former leader of the Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Both were eliminated by Israel in the fall of 2024. On the right, we can see the supreme leader of the Islamist Republic of Iran, Ali Khamenei. And as of this week, it is said that President Donald Trump vetoed against the Israeli army eliminating Khamenei. We will see how that develops. Millions and millions of Iranians would long for nothing more than his death. But yeah, to this day, he's still alive. Let us start with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei regularly calls for the destruction of Israel. The final solution, meaning the elimination of the Jewish state, is a paramount state objective of Iran. He, Khamenei, finances Hezbollah, the Houthi militias, and Hamas with billions of dollars and equips them with their military arsenals. Just recently, last week, reports have come out that had Iran developed actual nuclear missiles, the parts were supposed to be brought to Lebanon and to Gaza in order to be shot at Israel from there. Despite President Obama's widely praised Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iranian nuclear deal, Iran kept working on the abilities to produce nuclear weapons. And as of June 2025, they were believed to be only months away from actual having produced a nuclear weapon. So that's when Israel started to strike nuclear facilities, their nuclear infrastructure, in order to prevent Iran from ever achieving that goal and being in the position to actually be able to destroy the state of Israel, which, like I said, they have very often articulated as one of their major state objectives. Now I'm jumping from Iran to Gaza, to Hamas. Hamas is an Islamist terrorist organization headquartered in Gaza. 45% of Gaza's residents voted for Hamas in the last election that they had in 2006. In the picture, it's the picture that you also saw at the beginning of the presentation. You can see Yahya Sinwar here still alive, and he's holding up the son of a so-called Hamas martyr. Of course, it's them that call him that. So a fighter that died in combat with the Israeli forces. And he's holding up his son. He's carrying that gun. And you can see how even children are manipulated in this extremely anti-Semitic and hateful way, so that they grow up knowing that their main reason to live is to fight the Jewish enemy. And it is these circumstances that led to the truth
of the quotation that's often assigned to Golda Meir, but it might not be from her, that there will be peace with the Arabs once they love their children more than they hate us. I'm now going to read a little extract from the original charter of Hamas. Mujahideen. Even though the Islamic resistance movement looks forward to fulfill the promise of Allah, no matter how long it takes, because the Prophet of Allah says, "The last hour would not come until the Muslims fight against the Jews, and the Muslims would kill them until the Jews would hide themselves behind a stone or a tree, and a stone or a tree would say, 'Muslim or servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him.' But the tree of Garkad would not say it, for it is the tree of the Jews." Bukhari and Muslim. The motto of the Islamic resistance movement, Article 8. Allah is its goal. The messenger is its leader. The Quran is its constitution. Jihad is its methodology, and death for the sake of Allah is its most coveted desire. So, to all those who still believe that Hamas is some type of resistance movement and that there is some type of legitimacy to fighting the Israeli statehood, despite the numerous instances from history that I have showed here that there is no desire to create a situation of peace as long as there is a Jewish state on the Arab and Muslim land. To all those that still believe in the legitimacy of this fight because they think it's just people that were forced away from what was supposedly their land that are trying to fight for their rights. This charter is one of the many examples that shows it is not about the right to return to a certain land, or it's not about fighting for being heard. It's about anti-Semitism, and it's about the hatred against Jews. There was a document that Hamas published in addition to the charter in 2017, which is often quoted as a proof that Hamas is more moderate now. And I'm going to quote from that policy document, because it says, "Resistance and jihad for the liberation of Palestine remain a legitimate right, though they're still calling for jihad. The Zionist project is a racist, aggressive, and separatist project, and the Israeli state is the instrument of this project and its foundation. Hamas rejects any alternative to the complete and total liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea." So, for the complete destruction of the state of Israel, and that's what the parole from the river to the sea always means. It always means the destruction of the state of Israel, no matter how progressive the people that yell that, look how many Doc Martens they wear and how many shades of rainbow colors they have on them. Once they're yelling from the river to the sea, they're calling for the destruction of the Jewish state of Israel. Now, I am not going into further detail about further enemies of Israel closely linked to Iran. I'm not talking about Hezbollah here. I'm not talking about the Houthi militias here. What's important is to keep in mind that Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi militias are strongly funded by the Iranian government. They are proxies of the Islamic Republic, and their actions cannot be looked at distinct from each other. The murderous and barbaric attacks of October 7th have their roots in Iran. The regime's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was celebrating the slaughter with a video on X that showed Israelis running for their lives at Nova Music Festival. Now, I'm going to take a look at the state of Israel, and besides its history and its Jewish character, what are we looking at when we're looking at it? So, it has the population of 9.5 million people, including 7 million Jews and 2 million Arabs. It's a democratic, secular state where Arabs and Jews have equal civil rights. Arab Israelis can form political parties, they can be represented in parliament, and they are represented in parliament in large numbers. The Muslim faith, like any other religion, can be freely practiced in Israel. There is mosques, there you will hear muezzins, and walking through Israeli cities, the Muslim faith plays an important role. Nowhere in the Middle East or nowhere in North Africa do Muslims have more rights than in the State of Israel, more democratic rights. And that's highly relevant for members of the LGBTQI plus community. Tel Aviv is one of its capitals of the world. And, Israel's enemies like to call it pinkwashing, that they're only giving LGBT people that many rights in order to hide their wrongdoings in the fight against the Palestinians. But of course, that's just another anti-Semitically driven narrative. Israel is living up to what I quoted before from its Declaration of Independence. There are issues within the Israeli society that are debated very heatedly. Among those issues are certain laws that make it easier in certain circumstances for Jews to purchase property compared to other groups, compared to Arabs. Those laws are, like I said, the subject of a very heated democratic debate. Also, the judicial reform planned by the Netanyahu government is subject to an intense debate within the Israeli population, and regularly hundreds of thousands have been taken to the streets to protest against it. Of course, it is not some random German's task to evaluate whether what the Netanyahu government's planning there is problematic and whether the Israelis are protesting against it in the right way. But fortunately, we can just rely on the democratic processes within the Israeli society. This all shall show that the apartheid claim against the State of Israel is pure nonsense. Like I said before, Arabs are equal members of the Israeli society. Like I said before, 2 million Arabs can practice their faith, can take part in political parties and elections, and are equal members of society. It is the rulers of the West Bank and of Gaza that must be made responsible for the misery in which people live. It is these rulers that make the decision to indoctrinate their children with hatred against their Jewish enemy, that fill school books with anti-Semitic hatred, that keep up the laws and the situations in which people that are openly gay are tortured, are murdered in public, in which people that are said to negotiate or work together with Jews are tortured, are murdered. And these leaders must be made responsible for those barbaric circumstances. So I've already started talking about Gaza and the West Bank. Some more aspects. I've mentioned martyrs before. Palestinian martyrs, and that means terrorists that bomb themselves to death in Israel to kill as many Jews as possible, or that die in the fight against the Jewish enemy. They're praised in Gaza and in the West Bank, and their actions are publicly celebrated. Their families receive pensions for the rest of their lives for their children dying as martyrs. In public, sweets are given out once suicide bombers have bombed Israelis to death. Their children grow up in a highly anti-Semitic environment. I mentioned it before. School books portray Jews as liars and manipulators. Acts of violence like those of 10/7 are glorified. And again, LGBTQI plus people are regularly tortured and murdered in public. On top of that, don't forget that no single Jew lives in Gaza or could ever live in Gaza under Hamas rule. Now I have the data for what I briefly mentioned before. So before the current war, Gaza and the West Bank had the third highest living standard in the Arab world. At the same time, they receive the highest per capita amount of development aid worldwide. It's billions of dollars, billions of euros that flow into these areas. However, large amounts of the development aid funds flow into terrorism. The incredible tunnel network that Hamas built, the incredible arsenal of weapons has strongly been funded by these development aid dollars. For example, UNRWA employees, that's the refugee organization of the UN for only the Palestinian refugees, have been directly involved in the October 7th attacks. There is anti-Semitic UNRWA school books, and military infrastructure like tunnels and rockets have also highly been funded by these $8. So now, with these extra bits of information about the situation, let's take a look at anti-Zionism. We've talked about anti-Semitism before. Now, how is anti-Zionism linked to anti-Semitism? If you look at the word first, let me remind you that Zionism was the idea to form a secular Jewish state as the ability for Jews to defend themselves against hatred from outside. And then anti-Zionism is a movement that is directed against this idea of Jewish self-defense. To be more particular, you could say that it's directed against the idea of a Jewish state on Arab soil and land, against the state of Israel with its current borders. So why is it a synonym to Israel-related anti-Semitism? Today, Israel functions as a surface for anti-Semitic projections. Israel is a Jewish state. It is the only Jewish state. And in its function as a Jewish state, it's connected with the anti-Judaist Christian and Islamic stereotypes. What used to be the Jews as a group or as individuals is now the Jewish state. And the Jewish state is now the epitome of modernity with its bourgeois capitalist society and democratic system. To refer it back to one of the topics that were mentioned before, support of Israel is very often interpreted as a conspiracy. Like, why would people support Israel? There must be some reasons behind. There must be an explanation, because it cannot be for logical reasons or for, reasonable reasons. There must be some hidden agenda. And that, if you remember the introductory passages about anti-Semitism, looks very similar to the idea that Jews are the puppet masters that act behind the scenes and control the mechanisms of the world. We've almost reached the end, but now I want to read from the EU's working definition of anti-Semitism, and especially anti-Israeli anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Manifestations might include the targeting of the State of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Now, the passages that I'm reading from next will strongly remind you of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, I suppose. The EU in their document agrees that it is anti-Semitic to deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Denying the fact, scope, mechanisms, for example, gas chambers, or intentionality of the genocide of the Jewish people at the hands of National Socialist Germany and its supporters and accomplices during World War II, the Holocaust. Accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust, applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, for example, claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. And among the things that I just mentioned, we can see every aspect in the current debate. Now, Israel on October 7th was horribly attacked in a barbaric and murderous way by its Hamas Islamist terrorist neighbors, and its
doing everything it can to prevent that from ever happening again. Yet, it must legitimize its battle against these enemies over and over again, day to day. Just last week, tens of thousands of people went to the streets in the Netherlands to demand sanctions against the Israeli state. No other state in the world would be demanded to act in the way that Israel is demanded to act in. Then, when it comes to the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, now we find Israel as the child murderer, the murderer of Palestinian childs, and murdering children is one of the most classical anti-Semitic stereotypes. Comparisons between Israeli policies and the Nazis have been occurring over and over again for the past decades, and they are again now. Like, shouldn't the Jews have learned how to not do it because they were treated so horribly by the Nazis, and now it is them doing the same thing or even worse things with their Arab neighbors? And I've mentioned before that I was gonna briefly mention the Jerusalem Declaration of Independence. Very often, critics of Israel want to claim that the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism is not valid because it makes any criticism of Israel anti-Semitic, and it must be allowed to criticize Israel. Well, with the EU's working definition or with the IHRA's working definition, you could say, yes, of course, Israel can be criticized, but it can be criticized in ways that other countries would be criticized in as well. And once we're encountering these double standards, it's very likely that we're also encountering anti-Semitism. And the Jerusalem Declaration, that is excluding the particularly anti-Israeli sentiments of anti-Semitism that are the most valid, the most important ones today, the ones we encounter most often, therefore cannot be seen as an adequate definition of anti-Semitism. We're at the very end now, and I want to refer back to another definition of anti-Semitism, this time by French philosopher Sartre. Adorno has been putting a lot of work into, for example, the anti-Semitism chapter in the Dialectics of Enlightenment. And at one point he said everything that his analysis eventually led him to is already included in this essay on anti-Semitism as a passion by Sartre. Adorno, who fought tough battles with Sartre over philosophical topics, in this case said, the boy just got it. So Sartre says that anti-Semitism is most of all a passion. It does not resemble pure opinion or prejudice. It is the legitimization of emotions not based in experience. An attractive cognitive bias with a pleasurable and addictive character. It is the longing for simple explanations and the permitted drive discharge or instinct discharge instead of the strenuous effort of politico-economic insight. It is the rage against, in reality, one's own weakness. So connect that to what I said earlier, that in modernity, people encounter a more and more complex world with an economic system that creates great unequal and that is very complicated to really understand. And people suffer from it, but they do not refer to the complexity of an inhumane system, but to certain characters when it comes to expressing their rage and hate. And these characters might be labeled as Jews, or they might not be labeled as Jews. Nevertheless, this hatred leads to anti-Semitic ideology, or is a part of anti-Semitic ideology. They want to simplify. They want the simple explanations that Sartre is mentioning here. And they want to discharge their instincts and their drive against this group. They want to discharge their rage against weakness, and essentially it is their own weakness
that they're so hateful against. That's the projection part. Before my final remarks, I will read a longer passage from this essay that Sartre wrote on the reflections of the Jewish question. He, the anti-Semite, is a man who has no fear, not of the Jews, of course, but of himself, of his consciousness, of his freedom, of his instincts, of his responsibility, of loneliness, of change, of society and the world. Above all, except for the Jew. He is a coward who does not want to admit his cowardice, a murderer who suppresses and censors his lust for killing without being able to restrain it, and yet only dares to kill in effigy or in the anonymity of a crowd, a dissatisfied person who does not dare to rebel out of fear of the consequences of his defiance. By professing anti-Semitism, he does not simply adopt an opinion, but rather chooses it as his identity. He chooses the permanence and impenetrability of a stone, the total irresponsibility of the warrior who obeys his leaders and has no leader. He chooses to acquire nothing, to earn nothing, but instead to have everything given to him by birth. And he is not of noble descent. Finally, he chooses that the good is complete, beyond question, and unassailable. He does not dare to examine it out of fear of having to challenge it or seek something else. The Jew is here merely a pretext. In short, anti-Semitism is the fear of being human. The anti-Semite is the person who wants to be an unrelenting rock, a raging torrent, a destructive lightning bolt, anything just not a human being. As most of you know, racism, sexism, a variety of forms of discrimination are deeply rooted in our societies. Anti-Semitism has been a part of our society for centuries. We live in an anti-Semitic society. Now, in modernity and with the rising complexity of the world, with capitalist mechanisms of structuring society, anti-Semitic beliefs are fueled in an even stronger way, and at the same time, they're made more hardly visible than, from today's perspective, medieval forms of anti-Semitism, for example. It occurs more hidden than, for example, racism. And once again, it's deeply rooted within all parts of society. Those that are openly racist and reactionary, the center, and those that claim to be aware of and fight all forms of discrimination. In my experience, that is why even sources that we tend to rely on for progressive content, because we trust them to be aware and liberal and progressive, such as human rights organizations or left-leaning media outlets, show a strong anti-Israeli bias, and is therefore absolutely fathomable how people sharing their general ideas, so the general ideas of these outlets, start to be convinced by the position that they present, even without sharing anti-Semitic views first. However, these positions have grown in such a way because of an underlying, often subconscious anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic stereotypes that have allowed for that bias to grow over decades, over centuries. Like I said at the beginning, I used to be an anti-Zionist. I used to feel like I know what's right and wrong in this conflict, and I did read about it too. In, the media outlets that I trusted in. And only when I was challenged in those views by somebody else that had a lot of arguments, and only when I tried to read more and more to be able to battle his arguments in a better way, did I find out that the position that I was standing in and the argumentation that I wanted to make started to collapse the more that I read about it. And let me tell you, it's an inconvenient thing to do, to read more about it, to change your position, or to maybe even loosen your anti-Zionist views, because it is much more comfortable in the international left or amongst an international progressive community to have an anti-Israeli bias. Once you open that door, you are about to enter a room in which it is not just about Israel, but in which you can start to see many aspects in which the left that you used to maybe trust in so many things is short-sighted. And to nevertheless obtain an attitude with which you want to, turn the world into a better place, and in which you want to at least formulate critique of anything from left to right, can be a tough battle. But it can also be very motivating to, rely more strictly on logic, on reason, and on universalist ideas. We've reached the very end of the presentation. I have added 3 reading suggestions. If you are curious, if you're interested in reading more about pro-Israeli points of views, if you want to add to your regular media outlets such that do not share the anti-Israeli bias that I've mentioned before, I can recommend the Tablet Mag. For example, it's a Jewish magazine about the world. It's also very aesthetically pleasingly designed, and you will find a lot of content about Israel and the Middle East. Then I suggest reading Israeli sources. For example, the Jerusalem Post or the Times of Israel. They have English websites, they have English online versions of their newspapers. High recommendation here. And then I've picked 3 lectures or talks that I'm also recommending. One on the aftermath of the 1948 War of Independence by one of the most world-renowned historians on the topic, Benny Morris. You can find it on YouTube. You cannot copy and paste the link from this video, but like I said before, I've made a PDF with all of the sources accessible that you can find in the video notes. Then I've added a talk by German professor Stefan Griegert on the anti-Semitism of the Ayatollahs. Very up-to-date and very important during these days in the June of 2025, even though it's a little older. And Griegert is speaking in English to people at Indiana University in this talk. And then eventually a talk about something that I have not touched upon in this presentation, but that's also very important, the BDS movement. It's a talk about another German colleague. His name is Alex Feuerherd. It's translated into English in the video that I've attached here, The Israeli Boycott Movement, BDS, by Alex Feuerherd. Then you will also find links to 2 speeches of my own that I held at rallies here in Jena. One about the supposed empathy of the German left, the international left, the media for the suffering of the Palestinians, in which I am trying to show how much bigotry you can see in that supposed empathy, because it's only... They only care about the suffering of the Palestinians when it's the Jews' fault that they are supposedly suffering. But once they're suffering from their own regimes, the left is normally silent. Then I have another speech about the media bias against Israel. I've mentioned it briefly here. You'll find more examples and more about it in that speech. I've translated both speeches into English. And then I have one more article on the anti-Semitism of the United Nations. United Nations against Israel, Europe's UN votes, the same old game between Brussels and Ramallah, also in English. Now, thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening until here. I hope that I've been able to point out things in a clear way. Of course, I hope that I've been able to reach you. I am definitely open for discussions about whatever topics I mentioned here. I'm not open for anti-Semitic threats. I'm not open for
conversations that do not happen on the basis of reason and logic. I want to close this presentation with referring to what Adorno called the categorical imperative that Hitler imposed upon humanity. And it is that they, humans, must arrange their thinking and conduct so that Auschwitz never repeats itself, so that nothing similar ever happens again. The battle against the Jewish state shows the consistency of the anti-Semitic strive of anti-Semites. The fact that Jews are no longer dependent from others to defend them, but that they can defend themselves, is something that we must be incredibly grateful and happy about. And therefore, the solidarity with the fight of that Jewish state and the solidarity with the actions of the Israeli army that try to defeat their anti-Semitic enemies must be seen not only as proof that Adorno's categorical imperative is still valid and relevant, but also as a way to act in correspondence with that categorical imperative.